Good morning everyone and welcome. My name's Vicki Sutton. I'm CEO of Melbourne City Mission and I'm really pleased to be the facilitator for this morning's excellent keynote presentation. I'd like to welcome Melanie Redman and David Mackenzie. They're our guests here today and I'll formally introduce them a bit later on when we actually get to their sessions. But first I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. Pay my respects to the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation and my respects to elders past and present and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Melbourne City Mission are really proud to be sponsoring again this youth stream, ensuring that we keep at the forefront of our minds young people and the specific practices and research that makes our work effective for that group. After all, they make up 2 out of every 5 of Victorians experiencing homelessness. And as Steve Gates said yesterday, we'll never resolve homelessness unless we focus on prevention, and preventing young people from becoming homeless is important because that's a gateway into homelessness. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to all front practitioners here today. Our sponsorship enables 100 registrations for youth workers and practitioners of the front program, and I encourage all of you to see as many of the sessions as you can today. It's a great lineup. Now, before we get going, we're going to watch a home stretch video and we'll talk about that briefly afterwards.
What did you do on your 18th birthday? Have a party? Maybe have your first legal drink of alcohol? Or even get your driver's licence? Me? I had to find somewhere to live, learn how to survive on the dole, start fending for myself, because I grew up in foster care. That's how it works in Australia. As soon as you turn 18, the funding for out-of-home care stops. You're even cut off from your care worker. You're on your own. It's pretty crazy if you think about it. Kids are in out-of-home care because they've had it tough. They've often suffered physical and emotional abuse. They're vulnerable. Without a stable background, many of them just aren't prepared for adulthood. People wouldn't do it to their own kids. They often live with their parents until well into their 20s these days. The results are predictable. Too many of us end up with drug problems, mental health issues, living on the streets, or in jail. In the UK, New Zealand, Canada, even in the US, out-of-home care is extended until you're 21. There's high-level research by Deloitte showing how that actually benefits everyone. How for every extra dollar spent on providing out-of-home care till age 21, society benefits by at least $2 in reduced crime, mental health care, hospitalisation, homelessness and drug dependency. We see it already, where carers have taken it on themselves to continue providing out-of-home care past the age of 18. They're almost always better adjusted, healthier, more educated and more productive. Not every young adult in out-of-home care will choose to stay in care after they turn 18, but they all deserve that chance. It's time to give vulnerable young Australians more time, because just 3 more years of support and a place to call home can make a lifetime of difference.
So, as I became CEO of Melbourne City Mission, the interaction of homelessness with out-of-home care system was something that I wasn't aware of. I'm out of sector and it has, deeply shocked me as I came into the organisation to learn how broken our care system is, but also how the exit strategy for young people exiting out-of-home care is to drop them at Front Yard, our youth access point, on their 18th birthday. And it isn't an exaggeration to say that I've met a number of young people for whom that's their story. And I cannot imagine it. I've got a young son myself who is 6 months away from turning 18. He's studying VCE this year, and I cannot imagine having any conversation with him that would be around what he would be doing in less than 6 months' time, because he wouldn't have his bedroom, he wouldn't have his mother to cook his meal, he would have to worry about how he's going to pay for his living expenses. All my son has to focus on is getting up every day, hitting his books and studying for his exams, and we take care of everything else and make sure food's on the table. So when the state government steps into the breach and becomes the parent for these young people, I firmly believe, and I'm sure you join me, that responsibility doesn't end when you're 18. It's actually way too young in today's society. Most 18-year-olds still haven't even finished their final year of high school. And it's incumbent on all of us to push as hard as possible to change that. And we're obviously here talking about homelessness, and Front Yard is the state access point. It sees 2,000 young people every year. 20% of all of those young people are from the out-of-home care system. So if there's something that you can do today that's quite practical and that will make a difference, it will be to sign up to the Homestretch campaign and put the pressure on our Victorian government to extend the age of leaving from 18 to 21. We have had some progress in the lead up to the last election. The principles are there in terms of extending the care, but it's not currently available at all to all care leavers. In fact, it's only around 10%. And that's simply not good enough, because the evidence is in, and those young people, and if it was my son, they need it now. So I firmly encourage you to go to the exhibitions stall and sign up, and be very loud and vocal about this, that it's no longer acceptable for any young person to find themselves at my service, Front Yard, on their 18th birthday, because we haven't done an adequate job making sure that they're cared for until they've actually got their education established, their living skills established, and they're ready to look after themselves. All right, well, I would like to welcome our guests, Melanie Redman and David Mackenzie. Melanie's going to kick us off as our keynote speaker. She's the co-founder, president and CEO of Away Home Canada, a national coalition that is reimagining solutions to youth homelessness through transformations in policy, planning and practice. Away Home Canada has inspired communities and countries around the world to adopt the Way Home brand as a way to participate in a growing international movement for change. Melanie also leads the National Learning Community on Youth Homelessness in Canada. That's a pan-Canadian community of practice for youth homelessness service providers. Melanie's newest role is as the Partnership and Implementation Director for the Making the Shift network of Centres of Excellence, and that's co-led with Dr. Stephen Gates. Welcome, Melanie.
I took my shoes off, but I figure because I'm the keynote speaker, it's my prerogative, so hopefully they're not smelly. But yeah, it's wonderful to be here, and I'm hoping at the end of my talk that someone will remind me to come back and talk about raising the age of care in Canada and some of the unintended consequences and some of the things that you might learn as you go down that path. So I've been working with David Mackenzie for a long time on school-based early intervention. We call him DMAC in Canada. And he's been trying to get me down here for a long time, and it was really funny. I was reflecting, like, why have I been so resistant to making the journey to Australia? And then I thought, oh, it goes way back, way back. So I have an irrational fear of alligators and crocodiles. And I'm not kidding. It's a true story. And I made the mistake this morning of actually Googling crocodiles in Australia. And you have not one, but two kinds. So I was like, and then I was like, oh dear God, I went running in the Arboretum. Like, you have fresh water. So, but I'm actually glad to be here. It's a beautiful country, and we do have so many things in common in Canada. And one of the things, unfortunately, we have in common is that it's very expensive, and not all people have what they need to thrive. And so that's why I'm here to talk about some of the things we've been doing in Canada, how we're trying to hit it from every single angle to prevent and end youth homelessness, because it's ridiculous that we've allowed this crisis to linger. One of the things I'm going to really focus on are outcomes. Our work in Canada is around getting to outcomes beyond just whether or not somebody is housed for vulnerable young people. So outcomes in the areas of education, employment, well-being, social inclusion, all of the things that are going to make the difference between whether or not a young person is able to thrive and to evolve into adulthood, or they're going to be mired in chronic homelessness. And so that's really key. And all of the research that we have in Canada around what happens to young people currently when they exit homelessness, so through supports, through working with emergency services, et cetera, is not good. They're not living well. They have a lot of food insecurity, poverty, and they're just steps away from the streets again. And so we have to do better. And to do better, we're going to have to be really innovative. And so I'm going to talk you through how we've come at the problem in Canada, some of the things that we're learning, and some of the areas, of course, that we have so much more work to do, and a lot of learning to do from our international partners. You heard who we are and what we do. I think the key, though, is that we do convene the National Learning Community on Youth Homelessness. And this pan-Canadian community of practice is really important because it's the service providers, frontline workers doing the work day in and day out, but they also want to make the shift to prevention, and they want to focus their efforts in that space. And so we're engaged in this co-learning across the country around how to get that job done. So understanding youth homelessness in Canada, just a little bit of the context so you know we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. So when we talk about youth homelessness, we're talking about this definition that Steve and his team developed in pan-Canadian consultation with service providers, policymakers, people with lived experience. And so this is where we all landed, 13 to 24. And so that's really important because a lot of services don't start until people are 16. And we always imagine that 13 to 16-year-old group are somehow, they're the realm of child protection, but we know that that's often not the case, and that the child protection system in Canada was set up more than 100 years ago, focused on children, and it isn't designed to meet the needs of youth who often fall through the cracks. By the numbers, 40,000 young people over the course of a given year, 7,000 on any given night. And so Canada has about 37 million people. I think Steve highlighted that yesterday. So. And the key point for us, and it's amazing to me that it took so long for it to be clear that youth are distinct from adults and that we have to work with them differently in Canada, but unfortunately in many communities that's been the case. As soon as a young person becomes homeless, we expect them to just pull themselves up and be adults, bootstrap their way out of homelessness. And so we've often applied the same service models to young people that we would apply for adults. And again, that's the work that we're doing to change that. Why are youth different? I think there are. How many youth workers are in the room? Yeah, I bet you could all tell me how youth are different. They're very different because they're in the throes of adolescent development. And this is key, and this is something we try and drive home with our politicians. Like, we're not talking about like many adults walking around. We're talking about young people that their brains are still developing, and they need a lot of support, and they may not have experience in taking care of themselves, and getting out the door every morning, and taking care of a household, looking for a place to live. So these differences are critical. And so then back in 2016, we worked with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, Steve's team, to do the first ever national study on youth homelessness, the causes and conditions in Canada. And here are some of the things that we found. And if you want to dig a little deeper, you can find this online easily. We're also doing the second round of the Without a Home study right now, and we'll be releasing the results. And so some of the findings are pretty astounding. And so we know, very similar to Australia, the history of colonialism means that our Indigenous young peoples are overrepresented in the population. My screen is blinking. Is that one? Okay, so we're good. Maybe it's just me. And then Indigenous youth are overrepresented, young people who identify as LGBTQ2S, and we say 2S in Canada. Indigenous peoples call it two-spirited, so that's the 2S. And then racialized communities are overrepresented as well, and that term racialized is a term we use in Canada that a lot of other places don't use. And so these are really critical statistics because it starts to point you at the services and supports that are going to be needed for these young people. And the most shocking one that sticks with all of us in this work is just how many had their first experience of homelessness before they were 16. So 40%. And for that group of young people, they've had multiple experiences of homelessness generally. And so they've had a really, really difficult path getting to the service sector, even presenting at a homeless shelter. And so we'll talk a little more about that. The pathways into youth homelessness, as I was just mentioning, you know, young people, they don't go straight from it. It's what Steve was saying yesterday. Like people, you know, you don't know that a service is there when you're a young person. It's not like they leave home and they're like, okay, well, I'm going to go down to, you know, the Good Shepherd Center in downtown Hamilton and, you know, get myself some support. That's not what happens. And especially because so much of Canada, like Australia, there are rural environments, smaller communities, et cetera. The pathway in to eventually hit the service sector, a lot of really bad things can happen. And so young people often have to leave their community, right? Because they need to go eventually, after they burned out, you know, the social capital, they can't couch surf, the relatives want them to be gone, they can't go back home, they've been sleeping outside, but it's getting cold, so they often have to leave the community. And when that happens, it's tragic because they don't just leave the community, but they leave all of the natural supports that they had in that community. So maybe the family wasn't a safe place to be or a healthy place to be, but they had other folks, right? There were other people around them. And now they're going to have to go into a community and rely on paid supports. And Mike Lethby, he runs this organization called The Raft in Ontario, in this region, Niagara region. Beautiful, like Niagara Falls, wine country, really beautiful place. And so he runs an organization and a shelter for youth in the largest community in that whole region that's pretty rural. And you know, he talks about how, unfortunately, the pimps and the drug dealers have much better outreach than he and his team do. And they know that they just need to wait at the bus station, and the youth are going to be coming in from the rural areas on buses. And they're going to get them housed and back to school a lot faster than Mike's organization's going to do, unfortunately. So there's a lot of work that we're doing to keep young people supported in place so they don't make that journey to land in the larger community after a lot of bad things have happened. So the research and data are pointing to some important conclusions. We're waiting too long to intervene, right? So when that 13-year-old was in crisis, where were we? Second, the experience of homelessness is devastating impact on health, safety, mental health, well-being. Third, some young people are overrepresented in the population. Fourth, and key, the emergency response does not prevent or end youth homelessness. And fifth, our public systems are failing to prevent youth homelessness. And that video really illustrated that this morning. And when young people exit homelessness, recovery and inclusion are challenging. And finally, people with lived experience of youth homelessness tell us that we need to shift to prevention. And they can tell us exactly what moment would have prevented their experience of homelessness. So looking back, so I'm flashing back to 2013 because this is when I came to this work. I came from outside the sector. I was working on a number of other social issues in my career prior. So what were the conditions that I walked into? I took a job with one of the largest service organizations in Canada that work with young people experiencing homelessness. So at that time, there was no national organization focused on youth homelessness. Youth homelessness was not on the radar within government or in most municipalities. The Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness was emerging, and it copied its efforts from the National Alliance to End Homelessness in the States. And so that was a good thing, you know, organizing around homelessness, but their focus was on chronic homelessness and veterans homelessness. And at the time, they felt that youth homelessness was a distraction from this other mission, and that prevention would have to wait until we house all the chronically homeless people, which, coming in from the outside, I was like, this is crazy. What is this? We're warehousing children? So for me, coming from the outside, I think it was quite helpful because I didn't know what the rules were, and I think sometimes that's a good thing. And the national learning community on youth homelessness was in place, but it was a very small group of practitioners, about 12 at the time, from various parts of the country, who were doing innovative work in working with young people. And that was part of my new portfolio, was to manage this group. And then the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, which is Steve's team, They, around 2013, started publishing some key documents about youth homelessness and about prevention. And so I think I was really fortunate to come on to the work at a time when this thinking was getting underway and this dialogue was happening. And so a key piece of work right out the gates in 2013 was to grow the service network, because that was really important. You know, the more the merrier in that shared learning experience. And so we set out to do that, and we got some help from the private sector, actually from the Home Depot, the do-it-yourself, like big hardware stores in Canada, in growing this network, and they've been a fantastic partner in the work. And so we were doing a body of work as well called Mobilizing Local Capacity to End Youth Homelessness, and so we were doing a number of pilots in communities to develop strategies specific to youth homelessness prevention. And we were bringing folks around that table to help the communities do that work better. And so we brought folks like Steve Gates to the table, some policymakers, young people with lived experience, to advise these communities. And in this space, we were like, you know what? We need to go big on youth homelessness. There's no national voice on this. And so the idea emerged to develop a national coalition. And one of the hard things about that realization that we needed to do this thing, we needed to create an entity to hold the space on youth homelessness, was the recognition that it probably shouldn't be hosted by a service organization, because there would be times when what we would need to say would not necessarily be in the interests of particular service organizations. And so we wanted to create a space where we could have those hard conversations and have that be okay. And that also the service organizations could use us when they wouldn't be able to say the hard thing, but they could have us say the hard thing. And so we launched Away Home Canada in 2015 at the end of that year. And what was really cool is right out the gates, we had colleagues in the States say, we want to launch Away Home America, and so they did 6 months later at the White House. And then we had communities, Ottawa, Peterborough, Toronto, all these communities around Canada say, we want to adopt the Away Home brand as well. And I was like, oh God, what does that even mean? You want to call yourself what we are? But then we all landed on quickly, it's a movement for change. We want to make a shift to prevention and more sustainable exits from homelessness for young people. We want better outcomes for our young people. And so that's been really powerful, because now we have all these folks, Away Home Europe, et cetera, and we're just engaged in shared learning. Like, how do we do this work better? And so what does building a movement for change entail? Well, it entails a lot more gray hair than I had when I started, I think, for sure. So right out the gates, we had to develop a shared vision and agenda and get everybody on board. So all of these different stakeholders that I'll talk about in a second, like, what's our vision for change? And it's supporting a shift from a crisis response to prevention. And that's a pretty complex vision. So we had to sketch out what we thought needed to happen to get there. And so that was our initial vision paper. I had done a lot of work in human rights previously, and interestingly in Canada, the grounding our efforts in human rights wasn't part of the work back then, right? And so we worked with Leilani Farah, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, with her team to develop a practical manual for how to ground youth homelessness strategies at every order of government and in communities in international human rights. And we worked with young people with lived experience, and rights resonate with young people. Like, they know that they have rights, and we need to give them tools to be able to help hold us to account around those rights. So that was a big shift for us as well. This is a guide that's available now, I think, in 8 languages, if you are interested in checking that out, and feel free to adapt it in your community as well if you find it useful. The other thing that we had to do was we had to recognize that youth homelessness as a fusion policy issue. We had to start thinking about how we're going to work across all of these different sectors and all of these different stakeholders. How are we going to bring them to the table in meaningful ways to co-create solutions? And again, previously, the issue had just been dumped on the sector, and I'll talk about that in a second. We had to start thinking about changing how we work. And, you know, for all of its fraughtness, I think collective impact is probably the best framing we have for how to work across sectors and how to work toward a vision that's greater than our individual organizations. And there's some work, the Stanford Social Innovation Review around collective impact. We really like what happened in Canada. This Tamarack Institute evolved it even further to really focus on movement building, and that is much more in line with what we're doing. But the key to collective impact is taking off that organization hat and putting on the collective hat. And that is very, very difficult work. And it's so difficult, it's why it doesn't often happen. And we've been so excited. You have examples of that working well in Australia, and we've learned so much from that. And I'll get back to Geelong in just a second. We had to consider who's at the table, right? That was key. And foreground people with lived experience. And so one of the bodies of work we did in the last few years is a pan-Canadian consultation with people with lived experience of youth homelessness, and asked them what would it have taken to have prevented your experience of homelessness from ever happening. And let me tell you, they like I said earlier, they know. and that's what we should be listening to, because it points at the solutions. And so this body of work has been foundational for everything else that we've been doing. And we work at every turn to support young people to be engaged in the work, have their voices heard, but also what can we support how can we support the young people to continue to use these experiences of working with us to grow in their own lives and not just trot them out at the fundraiser, which I had way too much experience with that previously. And so we're learning how to do the work of engaging young people with lived experience much better than I think we did previously, but again, that's really difficult work and needs to be done well. This piece of work, I think, has been transformational, redefining the role of the homelessness service sector and doing that from the ground up with them. And so we engaged in a huge theory of change process with the service providers from across Canada, because previously they felt like it was their job to prevent and end youth homelessness, like just theirs, only theirs. They had this burden. And that's not a nice burden to have, especially when you're trying to support young people in crisis. You're trying to do the work, you're trying to keep the doors open, the lights on. It's really, really difficult. And so in this process with the service sector, they came to that their role in this whole collective vision to prevent and end youth homelessness was to shorten the amount of time any young person is mired in an emergency situation through transforming their policies and practices within their organization. And that was going to be their contribution to the broader vision to prevent and end youth homelessness, and that we would all work together across sectors around those prevention pieces, and I'll talk about that a little more later. When we first came to the work in 2013, there was a real anti-intellectualism in the sector. Folks, service providers were like, we don't need those damn researchers. We know what the problem is, we know what the solution is. And I'm like, well, I'm not sure we do know what the solution is. I think we know what the problems are. And it was really interesting to start to work really closely with researchers and service providers and policymakers and people with lived experience to co-create a national research agenda. So not just have the researchers come and tell us, I got this interesting question, and I want to explore it, and I want to interview all of your young people. But what do we all need to know in order to move the dial on the issue? And so from 2014 to 2016, we created this agenda to develop a point-in-time count toolkit specific for youth counts, so that communities would know how to best find where young people are. And so we developed that. Definition of youth homelessness, we got that job done. We wanted to start documenting program models that were showing success in sustainable exits from homelessness, showing success in prevention. So we've been doing that. The National Youth Homelessness Survey, this was a big one. Data management support for communities, this is ongoing work. Prevention framework, I'll talk about that in a minute, but we developed the roadmap for the prevention of youth homelessness. So we have a language and practical examples around prevention. And we tried to do a cost effectiveness study and worked with economists from Baker and Mackenzie and all sorts of really smart people, but we just don't have the administrative data and access to the data that we need to do that. So what we've done because the cost effectiveness study, depending on who you're talking to, that's an important tool in your toolbox. And so what we've done with this second national study on youth homelessness is we've built in a lot of questions that can get at service utilization. And so with this new study, we're going to be able to do some cost modeling. And I think that's going to be incredibly useful when we're, depending on who we're talking to. And next week, we may have a swing in government to a federal conservative government where it might be very useful to have that kind of argument in our back pocket. Oh, I hope that doesn't happen. Okay. Policy briefs. This is another thing that we've been developing based on the research that we've done, working with policymakers to craft policy recommendations across child welfare, mental health, across other systems and issues that are important, education. And so co-developing this agenda with the sector and delivering it has been really powerful in our collective work. We've been enhancing government relations. That's critical. You had the minister in here for housing and planning yesterday. And I can just see, you've developed really strong relationships where you can have hard conversations. You also, a lot of this work with government involves building trust. Like they have to know, where where we're at, right? Can they trust us? Can they come to us when they need data? Can they come to us when they need recommendations for how to proceed in a difficult context? And so we've been doing a lot of that work. Organizing philanthropy, and this is both, foundations, but it's also the private sector in organizing philanthropy. And so we have something called the Away Home Funders Table that we co-convene with funders. And it isn't about them giving us money, it's about us engaged in shared learning. And so some of the kinds of interesting things we've done with them is work to co-create new funding streams, not taking away old funding, but create new funding streams that are focused on prevention. So putting new money into the system for folks that want to do prevention work, and then helping them define what prevention is so that they know, oh, that's clearly prevention. That's something that we should be funding. And so this has been really powerful because, again, they have a voice and they have access to spaces, especially on the corporate side, on the private sector, that we don't have access to. When we first launched, actually I'll go back to that slide. When we first launched Away Home, and we first did that without a home national study, we did an event in Ottawa with the Home Depot Foundation, with the private sector, and the president, the CEO of Home Depot, they have 183 stores across Canada. They were able to get a meeting with every single relevant minister and took us in with the data and introduced us in our work. And we've now had those relationships and that access since because the private sector was able to open those doors for us. And so there was there's a developer in the room yesterday that we were talking about, yes, right there. We were talking about the role of the private sector, and I think, we have to think about unusual suspects. Some of the best work that I've done in communities has been with the police leading the charge at the table. And in landlords, how we engage landlords in really creative ways. And so, some of the folks that are part of the problem can also be part of the solutions, and I think we need to remember that. Engaging internationally has been critical because, I have like a few ideas in my head, but around the world there are a lot of ideas and some really good ones. And I know that video earlier about raising the age of care. In Europe, in a number of contexts, they've had something called the aftercare guarantee. That's a really powerful policy tool, and that's really allowed access to a lot of young people to have resources to go on to post-secondary education and to have support as long as they need. And so when we discovered the aftercare guarantee, we brought that back to Canada. Canada hasn't always, in Ontario, at least the province where I live, the age of care was just raised recently, and part of the advocacy around getting the age raised was showcasing the aftercare guarantee from Europe. Like, we were shopping it around, we're like, what about this, what about this? And likewise with school-based early intervention, like we've learned so much from Australia about that, and we're engaged in a lot of trial and error together to try and get it right. So that's really important. And then the next big piece of work that's been critical in Canada, and where it's ongoing learning, is around systems planning. And so remember I talked about that pilot that we were doing, the mobilizing local capacity. supporting communities to develop and implement strategies around youth homelessness prevention. Well, that's a complex body of work because it involves working across other systems as well. And so that's why there's an extra S on there. So it's not just about optimizing the homelessness serving system. It's about the engagement with those other systems around prevention. And that's really complex work. And we were talking in our session yesterday afternoon with someone that works on the Geelong project. I don't know if she's in the room. But we were talking about how critical the relational is in all of that. So it sounds so like cold systems planning, but it's actually a lot of relational work to get that job done, building those relationships with child protection workers, building those relationships with the police, et cetera. And so we've developed a body of work, perfect, youth homelessness community planning toolkit and other resources to support communities to get to the strategy faster so that they can actually do the difficult work, which is making it happen. So fostering social innovation, this is the last part, so it's good I have 10 minutes, perfect. What we realized is that, yes, there's a lot of knowledge out there, but there are also a lot of gaps in our knowledge. And so how are we going to create new knowledge, right? And do that in deep collaboration with community, and do that in deep collaboration with young people with lived experience. And then set the stage in policy so that we can enable it, and set the stage with funders to enable it once we have some of these solutions to fill those gaps. And so we went into a pretty serious competition. I'll tell you, I've never written and rewritten a proposal so many times in my life over the course of a year. But in Canada, we have this thing called the Research Tri-Council, and they fund research. And they had this competition for a network of centers of excellence, and they've never had one focused on social science before. It's always like medical tech transfer, bringing together the private sector, to create new medical devices, that kind of thing. And so we went into this competition with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness to establish a youth homelessness social innovation lab, and we actually won the competition, so that was kind of cool. But it gave us $17.9 million over 5 years to be able to actually invest in new research specific to prevention and sustained exits from homelessness, but also to mobilize that knowledge and to develop enhanced training and technical assistance for communities around prevention. So that's been very exciting. One of the first pieces of work we did was using what we heard from the young people with lived experience around prevention, using examples from around the world in policy and practice to build out this roadmap for the prevention of youth homelessness. And again, it has practical examples and a conceptual framing around youth homelessness prevention. And so this is driving all of our work right now. This network of centers of excellence has research theme areas and shifting to prevention and early intervention and sustaining exits from homelessness. And then cross-cutting themes around enabling health, well-being, and inclusion, enhancing outcomes for Indigenous youth, and that's Indigenous-led by Indigenous practitioners and Indigenous researchers. And it's been so exciting to work with them and to learn from them. And then also leveraging data and technology to drive policy and practice. And that's an area I don't know a lot, so I'm glad we brought some really smart people together. And what it does is it brings together researchers and practitioners and policymakers, people with lived experience from across disciplines to focus in on the problem of youth homelessness. Because there aren't that many youth homelessness researchers, and there's not a lot of spotlight on the issue, but now we've been able to use these resources to do that. And this is Steve's slide. This is so researchy. Look at this. This is the research to impact cycle. But yeah, this is what's driving. We recognize that it's actually really complex to take an idea, to take a new intervention around prevention and actually have it take root. And so we're basing a lot of our work on implementation science and lessons learned from the healthcare sector, actually, which is interesting. Before we got this network of centers of excellence, we were doing, we got a federal investment to do demonstration projects on models of prevention, Housing First for Youth, and the Upstream project, which is actually really cool. So we got an $11 million investment. Most of the money goes to service providers. We partner with them, And they work on these models of prevention and Housing First for Youth, and we do rigorous research and evaluation. We have a huge community of practice, and everybody's learning from each other and strengthening the work. And we're showing some pretty amazing outcomes in the areas of social inclusion, well-being, and education and employment. And so we've got these demonstration projects. Housing First for Youth. Steve is going to talk about Housing First for Youth in a session this afternoon. And so that's the adaptation of Housing First for the developmental needs of young people. And so testing it in 3 contexts: Ottawa, young people who are currently homeless; Toronto, Housing First for care leavers, and so a prevention model. And then in Hamilton, Housing First for Indigenous youth, and that's Indigenous-led, both on the practice side and the research side, and the development of the model itself. So Steve's going to deep dive on that this afternoon. And again, everything is focused on outcomes. And so these are the outcomes that we're driving toward: housing stability, health and well-being, education and employment, complementary supports, and social inclusion. So how do we work with service providers to get to these outcomes and get to these outcomes consistently? And so it's a huge amount of work, but our service provider partners are amazing. And so in the next years, we're going to be reporting out and developing tools and resources around all this work that anybody can access free and open source. So hopefully that could be of some value to all of you here today. And I want to end with recognizing the opportunity. This is actually grim, but then it gets better in terms of opportunity. So this is from the federal point-in-time count in 2018. It's the first ever mandated across the entire country. And we weren't surprised, but we were still distressed to see that more than 50% of people in the point-in-time count had their first experience of homelessness before they were 25, and even more disturbing, 22% between the ages of 13 and 17. And so again, going back to earlier, we're waiting too long to intervene. And so the opportunity is that we know where to go if we ever want to make a dent on chronic homelessness, and if we want to ensure the best possible outcomes for young people and their families. Thank you.
Wow. Amazing presentation, very inspiring. Well, now I'd like to welcome David Mackenzie to respond. David is an Associate Professor at the University of South Australia with a strong record of research and development on youth issues and youth policy, and he is widely recognised for his work on youth homelessness. In 2007 to 2008, he was one of the 4 commissioners responsible for the influential National Youth Commission inquiry into youth homelessness. David is the founder and current chair of Youth Development Australia Limited, a charitable NGO that operates as a platform for change, as well as providing backbone support for the community of schools and youth service model of early intervention, the COS model. The high-profile DeLong project, which was the subject of an award yesterday, was a pilot site. David is the founding director as well of Upstream Australia. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Vicki. I must write a much smaller bio in future. Look, when I heard that Steve Gates and Melanie Redman were to be keynote speakers at the CHP conference this year, I thought we are in for a real treat. Not only because Steve and Melanie are great communicators, colourful presenters, but because of the depth of their experience and knowledge, which is reflected in their content, I'm sure you'll agree. But also I knew they'd be challenging and critical, and they are real change makers in the movement in Canada, as you can tell from the presentation yesterday and Melanie's presentation today. And it's given us a lot to think about. A few comments. I just want to draw a couple of lessons. I'm not going to speak for long. I've been to Canada a few times, and I guess there's in a sort of everyday life sense, there's a certain familiarity about Canadians and Canada compared to the United States. I'm sure that many of you have travelled to both those places would probably say the same thing. And there are differences, of course, as well. Now, at the risk of oversimplification, I think if we look back, say, 15 years in Canada, the homelessness system would have been very much like the shelter system in the US. That's an oversimplification. But in the past 10 or 15 years, I think what we've seen is an incredibly vigorous process of innovation and creativity, and I think that comes through in what Melanie has shared with us today. And Melanie and Steve have been very much part of all of that, very much crucial to much of that, along with others. Now, I want to say, in our own defence, I think there is much that we can celebrate about what we've achieved in Australia in the homelessness service system. We began to face up to youth homelessness early on. We developed the Reconnect program, the world's first early intervention program for young people. We have the national data collection of homeless services managed by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. We have a national accepted sort of statistical definition. We collect national statistics on homelessness. That's an achievement. A few issues there, but nevertheless. But it's not helpful to sort of go on and on into a sort of an outpouring of self-congratulations, because you're not going to learn much from that. And I want to focus on a couple of points quite briefly. And in my opinion, I think our Canadian colleagues have done far better than us, much better than us, in creating a sustainable infrastructure in the homelessness problem space. And I think that's evident in Melanie's presentation. But I want to focus on two examples where I think this point is beyond obvious. And there are some lessons to learn which I think are also absolutely obvious. You've come across the Homelessness Hub in your sort of meanderings and wanderings through the internet on a Google tour. It's a fantastic achievement, set up by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, I think following the 2005 conference. I think in 2007 it was launched, probably fairly modest beginnings, and through a whole lot of resourceful stuff, which I don't know the full history, but I'm sure there's all kinds of stories about that. It's been built up to be what it is today, you know, involved in knowledge dissemination. It serves a whole range of different stakeholders. It's about making research more accessible. It's operated by the Observatory at the university in partnership with Away Home Canada and other organisations. It's terrific. It's a sustainable, impressive part of the infrastructure that's out there. You may not remember, but there was an Australian homelessness clearinghouse once. In 2004, I was on the Commonwealth Advisory Committee, and I worked with the CHP and Michael Horn, and we convinced the federal government that we needed an Australian homelessness clearing point. And I actually dug out of the archives quite a substantial paper that we prepared, had all the ideas. The federal government said, yes, we're going to do it. We stepped out, it was going to be put out to tender. We went for the tender, CHP, Y Foundations, I think it was RMIT, so University and Peak Organisation Coalition put up a brilliant response to that tender, didn't even get interviewed, and the department decided they would set up the website as a departmental website, which they did. And it ran for about 7 years, and there were some documents on the Australian Homelessness Clearinghouse. They spent a couple of $1 million and then closed it down. Look at the Homelessness Hub. Think about the poor old Australian Homelessness Clearinghouse. The lesson's obvious, isn't it? The second example is really being covered by Melanie, the Making the Shift demonstration projects. Do you remember the Innovation Action Projects program? For $25 million from the Victorian government. The Geelong project was one of the 11 projects. And that program was rolled out by the government department, run like they run most programs. KPMG was wheeled in to do the evaluations of the projects. Has anyone actually read any of those evaluation reports? Because I haven't seen them, they haven't been published. nor has there been a published report on what we've learned and the overall thing. By contrast, in Canada, Away Home Canada, in partnership with the Observatory and other partners, convinced government to invest in 10 demonstration projects, the Making the Shift demonstration program. The money came out of the Youth Employment Strategy. There's a whole story, I'm sure, in that one. The management of the projects, the research, the evaluation, the learnings, all of that is going on outside of the contract management for the money that went into those 10 demonstration projects. Melanie's talked about those. The innovation thing is gone, $25 million later. The lesson is obvious, I think. So there's my two examples. I just want to make two final points. Melanie's spoken about Away Home Canada, and I think what's interesting about that is, you know, we do many of those things. I think there's some interesting lessons to be learned from the agility of the coalition and in some of the things that they're doing, and I'm sure that many of my colleagues here today are sort of thinking about those things. It's a particular kind of approach, and perhaps we should do more of it here. We do some of it here. And the last point I want to make is Melanie mentioned collective impact and the power of collective action in passing, but it's pretty important to what they're doing there. And I want to say that this is much more than just a way to campaign. It is fundamentally, when you think about it deeply, potentially a paradigm shift from the current status quo of siloed departmental funded programs to a community-based paradigm with community collectives made up of services and programs and various stakeholders that have far more responsibility. Go and read the VCOS Communities Taking Power booklet, and the case for that is well put out there. And I think this is the big reform challenge that we face, and it's as much a challenge for government and departments as it is for agencies and stakeholders and all of us. And I think it's a challenge we have to face up to. I think that is the big reform change. It's not that we're not doing many good things, it's not that we don't have good programs, but if we want to make a difference and go down the track of prevention, rapid rehousing, working at both the front end and back end, there's got to be a change from the way that we're doing it currently. And I think that is collective impact.
Thank you, David. And yes, I agree with David. Excellent points. We need to do more together. What amazing speakers I've got. I didn't really need to remind them, close them down. They've kept us right on time, which means we've got some great amount of time now for your questions. So I'm going to look out in the audience and see if anyone's got some questions to kick us off before I get a free run at our speakers. You've got one? Excellent. Hi.
Hi, Melanie. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Do you want to if everyone can just introduce themselves and the organisation they're from when they start their question?
Yeah, I'm Kate. I'm from Melbourne City Mission. So Melbourne City Mission is a service provider, and you made a really interesting point about redefining the role of service providers so that the burden of fixing the whole system isn't just on them. Is there any advice that you can give to practitioners about the changes in policies and practices that helped them do that work in Canada?
Yeah. I'll give you an example of where we've seen such a positive change because we introduced Youth Reconnect, actually. The model from Australia is one of the demonstration projects in Hamilton, Ontario. And it's our community partner that's delivering the program actually runs the mission, the emergency services. They're called Good Shepherd. And what was really interesting is, they were excited to take it on because it's, prevention. They're able to get at the younger youth with that program and with those resources. And what was interesting is the service providers working in the organization, when the job postings came up for the positions, the Youth Reconnect positions, everybody went for them, like everybody. And, and it was very competitive, and not everyone got the positions, but the people that got the positions, in the developmental evaluation we're doing with them report their job satisfaction has gone through the roof. The roof because they're doing the work that they want to be doing, which is supporting young people and their families when they're in crisis and stopping them from coming into the shelter. Because, like I mentioned, and a lot of bad things happen before they actually come into the shelter. And so I think that there are a few things. One is about taking the burden off of the service providers that you have to do all this alone, but the other is about enabling the kind of work that is better work for everyone. It leads to better outcomes for young people, and it leads to better work for you, the worker. I think it's been really, really interesting to start to challenge just the existence of shelters in the youth space in general. And I think the people that work inside of the shelters are very vocal advocates for needing to have responses that are not emergency shelters. Like in Toronto, Covenant House is the largest service provider, and it's, one of the largest service providers in the world. They work in North America, but Central America as well. And what's very interesting is they did a study across the sites in Canada, in Vancouver and Toronto, but also in their other sites around the world, asking young people if they'd ever been approached while they were in the shelter to work in the sex trade. And pretty much everyone said, oh yeah. And it's because we've created these spaces where everybody knows vulnerable young people are. And so it's the people working within the shelter system, the workers, that actually think that, the warehousing young people is the wrong approach. And so are some of the most vocal advocates for shifting the response and having other options, especially getting them out of there as quickly as possible into housing and supports that are appropriate for their age and their desires. So I don't know if that's a lot of answers, and maybe not even to your question, but is that helpful? Okay.
Great. Next question. We've got a couple down here, so if we can have some microphones. Yep, down there. They're first, and then the second row next. Great. That down there? Yep, thank you.
Hi, my name is Achol, and I'm from Melbourne City Mission. I work at Front Yard, the statewide access point for youth homelessness. My question is around moving from a crisis to a response mode, and often we kind of find ourselves referring to Front Yard as a crisis service. So I really like the point you made about the shared vision and agenda from crisis to respond. So what's your advice around that?
Did you hear that question well? Can you repeat it to me?
Could you just repeat that? Just
so
your final
sorry.
question. It was about moving from a crisis to
Respond.
response.
Yeah.
And what was the question for Melanie?
I guess what's your advice on that?
I think we just did this project in, again, Hamilton, Ontario. It's kind of our sandbox right now for innovation, because they have a lot of really interesting characteristics present in the community. Plus, they're small enough, it's a city that's small enough where you can actually, it's not as complex as a place like Melbourne. And so one of the things that we did is and Steve was talking about duty to assist yesterday, so we're trying out duty to assist on youth homelessness in Hamilton. And one of the really cool things that we did was work with young people with lived experience and service providers and folks from, child protection, schools, et cetera, to start to map across each of those different systems what would early intervention look like so that we could enable a duty to assist. And that's been an amazing exercise, because you start to think, and you could do that in any community here. You could say, okay, let's be very intentional. And we're using human-centered design, which is just a fancy way of actually putting the young person in the center of the experience and being walking with them through the education system. Well, what are the points of intervention? Who are the people, and how could they have helped? And so, we're doing that with child protection next. And we're going to do that with criminal justice, and do that, and engage everybody in that dialogue. How can we do things differently? And so I think that's my advice, is you have to start engaging those other systems and talking about how can we work together, what can we do differently that's going to be centered on the needs of the young person when they're in crisis.
Thank you. We've got a question here in the second row. And can I just have hands up for the next question? So if that microphone could be shifted back there for when we get to it. Okay, so to you.
Good morning. My name's Mary and I'm from Mallee Family Care in Swan Hill. This is my colleague Janet. More really of a comment. We try to support young people leaving care that present to our office that have nowhere to go. It's difficult because in rural communities we don't have crisis accommodation. We have limited transitional properties, and often young people 15 and 16 cannot be placed on them. They can't get onto the public housing waiting list because of their ages. And it's really tricky. You know, we have one caravan park that we can use, but to stay there it's $275 a week, which is out of reach for young people. We have motels, well, one motel that will accept our clients but will not accept young people for obvious reasons, safety.
That's terrific. Maybe we can throw to Melanie, because you did mention rural and regional, and ask if there's any lessons you've got from how you can better support that group through this work.
Yeah, host homes is one idea that rural communities and suburban communities in Canada are experimenting with, and it comes from a model in the UK called Night Stop that has years and years of evidence behind it. And one of our partners in Canada right now with 360 Kids in York region outside of Toronto, they've decided to take the host homes program they've been working on and have versions of it that are more like supported lodgings, and so longer stays for young people. And you know, what's really great about something like host homes is it mobilizes the community to be part of the solution, and that folks want to be. And you know, I mean, there's rigorous training and vetting and support and everything that needs to be present. It's a partnership with the service providers to do the case management, et cetera. But people have spaces in their homes and they want to help. And there could also be some private sector developer partnership opportunities in that as well. And maybe other folks in the room have some ideas of what you've seen working well here in Australia that you'd like to add.
And just one final comment too, with the child protection system and children leaving care. I was born in England, and when I visited there a few years ago, they have fantastic innovative ideas around the support of parents and their children, and put the whole family into a foster care situation. And it's amazing. I lived within this family for a few weeks to see all the great work that the foster carers are doing with the mums, not looking after their children, but teaching the mum how to do it and mentoring the mum, dads and children.
Fantastic.
Exactly.
Thank you.
A lot of the work in Canada is around how do we stop apprehensions and support families. So I think if you hit it from that end and you have models of support and accommodation for young people exiting.
David.
Look, I hope you don't mind. I just wanted to go back to the previous question from your colleague at Melbourne City Mission. I remember being involved in a little project called OK 3000, and that was really trying to think about what would early intervention mean in an inner city drop-in centre, which Front Yard is an excellent service, by the way. And one of the things was that people would come in and you had to provide them with some sort of shelter for the night. They'd be sent to the refuge that I think at the time Melbourne City Mission ran. I think it's changed now. But they never came back. They were supposed to come back to get other help to reconnect them back to where they might have come from. A lot of the young people and people who come into the city and perhaps sleep rough or have nowhere else to sleep have only been homeless for a relatively short time. They're not all chronically homeless by any means. So the appropriate response, and I think Melbourne City Mission struggled to get a reconnect program because the government said, well, what does that mean? It doesn't make any sense, but it does. Because if you've got a reconnect worker or an early intervention worker that can spend the time the next day, simply, I mean, I think my advice in the project was simply, well, don't wait for them to come back, go out to where they are at 8 o'clock, have breakfast with them, and then take them somewhere else and sort out the issues so they go back and reconnect with their family or whoever, somebody in their community where they came from, rather than pushing them into the homelessness service system, because what happens, as we all know, is that leads to that and that moves on, and next minute they're in various supported accommodation and there's a whole thing going on. So I think that's my understanding, Melbourne City Mission has done that well, and that's still part of the modus operandi of what happens in the city. I just wanted to sort of highlight that.
Thank you, David. Yes, there are a whole range of programs that look to reconnect people with their family, including Reconnect. From a lot of practitioners here today from Frump who work really hard to get young people back with their families, so that only the handful of crisis beds that are available go to those that have no other choice. Now, we did have a question down there.
Quinn Pawson from Vincent Care Victoria. Melanie, you mentioned the redefining the role of the service sector and some measures. I'm wondering whether you could unpack the measures for me a little bit.
The which measures in particular?
The measures in redefining the service sector from having to solve the whole problem to being a lot more specific about
so the
its
theory of
specific
change work.
role.
Yeah, the theory of change work that we did. So the goal for the Pan-Canadian National Learning Community is to shorten the amount of time that any young person is mired in an emergency situation. I think they've got that down to 5 or less days is what they're thinking. And I'm looking at Amanda from my team. I'm like, is that correct? Please tell me I've got that right. And starting to actually, they're working with a number of researchers right now to figure out what those actual measures are going to be. In terms of the shifting of the policies and practices within their organization to actually get to that kind of outcome. So that's underway. But I wanted to say, you're the person from the organization that did all the work to transform your services to be LGBTQ inclusive. Is that true? But I wanted to say congratulations. That's such important work, and that's a lot of the work that we're engaged in as well. But you're right, that's very difficult work. We've developed an LGBTQ2S toolkit to support practitioners to be able to do that work in their organizations. And we've seen an interesting example is Covenant House in Toronto. You know, it's historically a faith-based organization, and for many years had policies and programs that were very exclusive and harmful, and have gone through similar work and transformed everything that they do till the point that it's probably the most inclusive and welcoming organization in the country. So kudos. Yeah.
David, any final comments?
Yeah, that's the challenge of how you engage with mainstream systems. I mean, I've heard for decades complaints in the homelessness sector that we deal with the failure of these other systems, and there's some truth in that. But how do you engage with systems? Homelessness is the issue for which homelessness services exist and what people are focused on. If you go to a school, homelessness is just one small issue amongst a host of other issues. If you go to a hospital, homelessness comes up. Some people who go through the hospital are homeless. It's a small part of what they do. And it seems to me that where we've been able to make a bit of a breakthrough in deeply engaging with these mainstream systems is when you actually take it down on a community level. Now, there are some things that need to happen up the line in terms of policy, etc. But it's all very well. You can put out a booklet in the health system saying helping homeless people through the health system. Or there's been booklets put out through the education system about dealing with homelessness in schools. Well, who reads them? And, that doesn't make change. But if you can engage with the organisations or the schools or whatever they are, at the local level, you're dealing with real people, you meet together regularly, you start to do the collective impact sort of stuff. And I think that's probably the most promising point at which we can actually make that work. Because we haven't done very well at making it work by other means and other approaches. So that would be my thought for the day.
Well, I would like to, I'm afraid we're out of time, but Melanie and David will both be here in morning tea, and I know, Ethan, you'll have great questions. So I encourage you to make your way up and talk to them in morning tea. So please join me in thanking our guests today. They're fantastic.
Great presentation. Really good.
Hey, everybody. Now, don't get confused and think it's morning tea time. We've got something very important to do before we get to morning tea. So for those of you that weren't here yesterday, my name's Jenny Smith and I'm CEO of the Council to Homeless Persons, Victoria's homelessness peak body, and who've presented this conference for you. Great to have you all here, and thanks to Melanie and David for a great presentation. Provoking our thoughts, I think, about what we can do about our local policy and service approach to youth homelessness. And Vicki, wherever you've gone to, there you are. Many thanks again for Melbourne City Mission and Frump's partnership in the conference. And the session that we've just had provides a perfect segue for us to have Melanie and Stephen formally launch the October 2019 edition of Parity, Preventing and Sustaining Exits from Youth Homelessness in Canada. And you've all got one. We lost control, printed some additional copies, so you can all have one today. Now, you all know Melanie from this morning, and hopefully most of you will know Stephen from yesterday, who are our guests for this conference, our keynote speakers. And yesterday Stephen told us about the work that's being undertaken in Canada and discussed its relevance to our own situation, and we all looked at some of the commonalities as well as some of the differences that we have. And today we've just heard from Melanie outlining the Canadian expertise and experience in relation to youth homelessness and some of the implications for us here in Oz. And as we all have, I think, underlined in the last day and a bit, you know, there are a lot of commonalities between our two countries. The British put our key institutions into place. Our First Peoples were both dispossessed and live with that legacy of dispossession. And we're both wealthy First Nation countries marked by inequality and social policies that are just failing to respond to that inequality. So there clearly is much for us to learn from the Canadian approach to homelessness, and particularly youth homelessness, and I think a lot for us to go forward in a partnership over time into the future. And so in that context, we've applied a lot of maple syrup, not just to the conference, but also to this edition of Parity. And you know Parity exists to provide a platform where we can collectively share our understandings of homelessness and try and influence the development of policies and of effective services as we roll on. And there's a bit for us to envy in relation to Canada. We can envy Canada's emphasis on homelessness prevention. We can envy Canada's emphasis on sustaining exits from homelessness. But we can hope to emulate this as well as enshrining housing first principles in our policy and service approaches to homelessness. This edition has really been a fantastic partnership and a great opportunity for Noel Murray. Where's Noel? Yeah, he'd be hiding back here. Thank you, Jackie. He couldn't get any further away, could he, really? It's amazing. But Noel has worked really closely with Amanda Buckner, who's up here on the table as well, to create this edition of Parity. And Stephen, it's great to have you here with us this morning as well, just back from a bout with Virginia Trioli on 774, I believe. Very good. So, enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Melanie and Stephen to launch this edition of Parity. Well, you've already heard a lot from me this morning, so I'm going to make Steve talk for a couple of minutes here.
And I know you're all thinking, oh, not him again. But this is a really exciting thing for us. We don't have anything like this in Canada, Parity. There's certainly not in the United States. I don't know if anywhere else in the world you do this. Plain language, content that's thought-provoking and oriented towards improving the world, right? And so to be able to participate in this is delightful. And for us, it comes after, I think, a long engagement with Australia. We've been advocating for a shift to prevention for at least a decade. In North America, as I mentioned yesterday, it's a dirty word. It's like, well, we'll move to prevention once we house all the chronically homeless people. And if you've ever been to any American city, you know how well that's going. And so the important thing for us is that we've managed to influence a shift at the level of the Government of Canada, but also community level across Canada, where people are now getting it and going, prevention, yeah, it makes sense. Car accidents, it makes sense to prevent people by having seatbelts. We should prevent cancer by having people stop smoking, you know, like, so why shouldn't we focus on prevention of homelessness? Yeah, let's do it. And then people pause and they're like, but I'm not sure what that looks like, right? And so for us, finding out in Australia years ago that you were leaders in prevention, and in particular, from my understanding around youth homelessness prevention, it was like, wow, you can do this. This is great. We're going to come and steal all your ideas, take them back to Canada. Now in Canada, the other thing we decided to do is figure out, like, well, what's happening in Canada that's focusing on prevention of youth homelessness? Because a big challenge in the world of homelessness is innovation stays really close to the ground. So people work in their community, are doing really great work. They're not resourced to develop program model guides or promote the work, but it's happening. And so the opportunity to pull together from across Canada a whole volume on where people are doing youth homelessness prevention is exciting, but also important, because it's exactly this kind of knowledge that we need to bring to communities that say, oh, we can't do prevention, or I don't understand how to do it. It's like, read this. By the way, after this session, I'm going to go read this again, because now it's got pictures, and that helps me. But it's fantastic. Australia, I believe, is a country that has been at the vanguard of prevention, and I don't know if it's ebbed and flows or like where things are at now. Maybe you need an addition. That's prevention in Australia, if you haven't done that. But this is going to be so helpful in our cause to help ensure people don't have to endure homelessness. So thank you.
Yeah, and it's been wonderful working with CHP and Noel. He's a real workhorse over there, like driving us, like, why don't I have my draft? Like, no, he's actually been wonderful to work with. But I need to thank him. So, Steve and I often will have like these wild ideas. Oh yeah, let's work with them. They've invited us to do an edition on Canada and prevention. And then always there's somebody that actually has to pull that off. And so Amanda from my team, we call Amanda Tabs because Amanda has a public policy background and keeps tabs on government for us. But Amanda is her actual name. But I'd like to let her say a few words about this process because we're so grateful for all your hard work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Melanie and Steve, for giving me the opportunity to do something like this. It's been a really cool process to bring people together from the very beginning. When we met Noel for the first time and told about the project, it was very exciting. And then pulling together people from research, policy, and practice and lived experience to really figure out how we're going to capture the diverse perspectives that exist in Canada on prevention. And so when you're reading through this, it really becomes clear that there are some really beautiful pieces, people with lived experience that we hadn't had contact with but reached out to us because they had lived experience of youth homelessness and wanted to share their story. And it tied in so beautifully with the practice sides of things and what's been happening at the national level with Way Home and with Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and making the shift. So there was an amazing team of people that supported me as well. I wasn't doing it alone. So yes, and I hear that, Noel, you don't like to be thanked, so I won't belabor it, but you've been lovely. It's just been a truly wonderful process, and I'm very excited with how this has all come together. So I hope you enjoy reading it. I hope that if you have questions about the authors or what came out in this, you're more than welcome to reach out to us, and we're happy to connect you with people that were involved in this whole edition. So thank you.
They're so tall. I've got a photo of me standing between Steve and Melanie, and I look like sort of the rugby bit of the goalpost. You know? Many of you have heard me talk before about how important all your support is for parity and how it wouldn't happen without sponsorship. And so many of you have supported so many editions of parity. But on this occasion, the thanks is for Steve and Melanie for providing that sponsorship, without which this edition and this partnership wouldn't have happened. So thank you very much. Amanda, formal thanks to you and to your colleagues on your steering committee that did put this together. I know Noel did quite a few early morning phone calls with you, and I did one, but I ran out of steam after that. So it was, they did a great job, but you are a dynamo, and I know how much your professionalism has contributed to the result that we have today. I'd like you all to feel for poor Noel Murray, who's got to go off to Calgary in Canada really soon for the Canadian launch of this edition of Parity. But Melanie and Stephen, I really hope you will pass on our thanks and appreciation to all of your colleagues. And as I said, we really look forward to having, got to know you even better now, continuing to swap notes with you into the future. Now, as you go out to morning tea, I want to invite you to wander over to the CHP table and have a look at the capability framework that we together as a sector have developed in partnership with the Department of Human Services. It's a framework for people at the coalface, the work that you're doing on the ground, and it speaks to the capabilities that we need as entry-level workers, that we need as emerging leaders, and that we have as leaders. So we're thinking it's going to be really useful for job descriptions as well as for informing the development of training going forward. So we've held on to that for a little while and we're launching it here. So do take the opportunity to go and get one of the copies. It's in Noel Murray's footy team's colours, that sort of royal blue and white, so you'll enjoy that. It's time for morning tea. Thank you very much. We'll see you back here afterwards.
This thing goes tomorrow.